Hi everyone, welcome back to Philosophy in the Sun. This is episode 6 in my series on Wednesday, the Netflix show, and philosophy, as well as a little bit of disability theory thrown in. So this episode, we're going to be focusing on ethics of care. And we're also going to be taking a quick look at the plot of this episode. So this episode is definitely my favorite one so far. The plot of the episode is that Enid and her best friend and roommate, Wednesday, switch bodies. So their friendship is getting a little bit fractured at this point in the series. Wednesday messes around with some black magic, as you do, and they swap bodies. So
No. No, 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 no. Enid? What the hell happened to me? Why am I staring at me? Because we've somehow swapped bodies.
but for me, this body swap situation got me thinking. Because you see in this episode that Enid and Wednesday are forced to openly admit that they care about each other eventually. The only way to restore the spell is to admit that they are in fact besties, and that's how they eventually switch back into each other's bodies. And as I was watching this, I was wondering, okay, how can we understand Wednesday's ethics? Because we've seen her throughout season 2 and throughout season 1 kind of use a whole bunch of different types of ethical thought to justify her behavior. So she doesn't tend to like discrimination, so she will lash out at her school. She doesn't like to be told what to do. She'll do whatever she's being told not to do. And we don't see a really consistent, clear threat, yet she's clearly a really consistently moral person. And as I've mentioned in a few reviews back, I think there's an argument to see her as a character who's autistic, and having a strong moral center is often, but of course not always, a characteristic of autistic people, as well as, of course, just everyone. So a strong sense of morality. We see that. But I've been thinking, okay, so what system of ethics is our girl using? And I would argue that actually in this episode, we finally see, I think it's ethics of care. And this system of ethics is a bit different from some types of ethics that are more traditional in philosophy. So types of ethics that are more rule-based. So for instance, we were talking last week about Immanuel Kant, and care ethics is kind of what one might consider the opposite. So instead of saying in a moral dilemma, like, oh no, I've been switched into my best friend's body, what rule ought I follow to resolve this situation? What one does is think, in order to do the right thing, how am I going to set things right amongst the people I care about and in the relationships I care about? How am I actually going to go about solving this dilemma in relationship with the people who I care about? And we see it's not until Enid and Wednesday actually girl up and are willing to do this somewhat challenging activity. This is ethic of care, move of actually listening to the other's perspective and taking it on openly while still staying true to their own voices and their own perspective. Are they able to switch back into their own bodies?
I regret ever underestimating you.
Now, this little moment here between Wednesday and Enid at the end of episode 6 really put me in mind of one of the greatest philosophers of care ethics, I would argue, of all time, Carol Gilligan. She was writing in the 1970s, researching in the 1970s and writing. And what she did was really kind of overturn a big chunk of the sort of dogmatic canon of philosophy, her discipline, and psychology, which is really where she started her work. At the time, the 1970s, there was a belief that in order for people, men and women and girls in particular, to develop strong ethical senses, one kind of needed to lean a little bit more towards Kant in terms of one's ethical thinking. And what Carol Gilligan did was she came along and she took the revolutionary step of actually interviewing boys, and especially girls, young girls around Enid and Wednesday's age in the show, 15, 16, and asking them how they would approach moral dilemmas. And this is where she comes up with the title of her groundworking book in a different voice, because what she discovered is that young girls would tend to bring forward a perspective on ethical dilemmas that was a bit different than the traditional, perhaps more dogmatic voice from centuries of philosophy. So the sort of centuries of philosophy voice, to kind of oversimplify, might say something like, you must never steal, because if you steal, society itself might eventually collapse if everyone did it. So when girls are presented with a moral dilemma, such as, all right, can I steal just this once if I have to steal in order to make sure that my best friend is going to survive, right? So the girls that Gilligan was interviewing would tend to say, I don't know, man, it's complicated. It depends who you are. It depends who your friend is. It depends on the kind of situation you're in. And it depends on the relationships that connect different people. And at the time, in the 1970s, the response from the psychology community was, that means that girls are less morally developed, because the boys tended, in general, to say something like, no, stealing's wrong, you can't steal. Even if it's to save someone's life, no stealing, stealing's wrong, the end. And the prevailing view at the time was, hey, okay, that means boys are a little bit more developed than men. What Carol Gilligan does, when she develops the ethics of care, she says, hey, wait a second, I don't think that makes any sense. Clearly, there's a different voice coming from girls and women. And this ethical voice is just as valid as the one that comes from the more masculine perspective and from the history of philosophy, saying there's clear and absolute rules. Hey, the perspective that what morality really is how we connect with each other, is actually also valid. And very interestingly, too, she also found that this voice came from young men as well as young girls, but they were a little more hesitant to put forward their perspective. And I'll just have a little clip of Carol Gilligan here.
This guy for sort of eternal principles, whether they were Kantian principles or whatever, was like, no, look around you. You live, it's like we live on a trampoline, and if we move, it affects a whole lot of people. So you have to be very aware of those relationships. So it was not as if women were taking the opposite. They were questioning the whole paradigm, not explicitly, but implicitly.
And I think it's interesting that the tension of episode 6 isn't really resolved until the leads are willing to put in the work that I would argue one needs to do in order to be a good care ethicist, and that is to listen to oneself, to one's own voice, and the perspective of others without drawing dogmatic lines of blunt and unexamined definitions of right and wrong. And we do finally see Enid and Wednesday do this in this episode.